Hello and welcome to Lesson 3 of Social Studies, What Conflicts Changed the Southeast? So we're going to continue with chapter 3 on the Southeast, and we're going to begin our reading. Growth leads to conflict. After winning the Revolutionary War, America took possession of the land west of the original colonies all the way to the Mississippi River. The main settlers began to move west to have more room for their families and more land for farming. Some people thought they would get rich by finding gold and silver. Others were just interested in moving someplace new. By moving west, the colonists came into conflict with the Native Americans who had always lived in Kentucky, Tennessee, and other western lands. When these settlers moved west, they saw that the land was fertile for farming. Plantations could now be larger. More land meant more work. Plantation owners wanted more enslaved people to do the work. Slavery soon stretched from the Atlantic Ocean past the Mississippi River all the way to what is now Texas. The expansion of slavery into the West Territories would create conflict between the North and the South. Let's go ahead and take a look at your workbooks for this lesson. So in this lesson, we're going to use our investigative skills to explore how conflicts about Native Americans, slavery, and civil rights for African Americans shaped the Southeast. Reading and talking about the conflict will help you learn about what has shaped the Southeast region of the United States. All right, and as always, make sure you're following the directions in the blue bars and complete the tasks that they're asking you. Number 1, look at the text and the image. What do you think this page will be about? Circle words and phrases that you do not know. Underline the details that help you answer the question, who, what, where, when, or why. Discuss some dangers enslaved people faced while traveling on the Underground Railroad. Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad. Harriet Tubman was born an enslaved person in Maryland. She worked in the fields and suffered terrible beatings. In 1849, she escaped slavery. She left her husband and family behind in order to escape. Even though she was in danger of being recaptured, she returned to the South at least 19 times to help others escape. She was determined to lead other enslaved people to freedom along the Underground Railroad. As a result, Harriet Tubman became famous as a leader or conductor on the Underground Railroad. As a conductor, Tubman's job was to help enslaved people avoid capture. Sometimes Tubman used the song "Wade in the Water" to tell those escaping slavery to get off of a marked trail and go into the water. She wanted to make sure the dogs used by the people looking for them couldn't sniff out their trail. People who walked through the water did not leave a scent trail that dogs could follow. Because many enslaved people knew the secret meanings of these kinds of songs, they could be used to give directions. Read the words of "Wade in the Water." Primary source, in their words, African American spiritual, wade in the water. Wade in the water, wade in the water, children. Wade in the water, God's gonna trouble the water. See the host all dressed in white, God's gonna trouble the water. The leader looks like an Israelite, God's gonna trouble the water. Set the band all dressed in red, God's gonna trouble the water. Looks like the band that Moses led, God's gonna trouble the water. When those escaping slavery traveled north, they traveled at night. They used the stars to help guide their journey. The North Star directed them. To locate the North Star, they looked in the sky to find the Big Dipper and the Little Dipper constellations. Travelers along the Underground Railroad were told to follow the drinking gourd, or the Big Dipper, which points to the North Star. Let's go ahead and take a look at our first graphic organizer. We're continuing working on causes and effects, just like we were working in the last lesson. So our first cause here is that Harriet Tubman escaped slavery. The effect was that she was able to become a conductor on the Underground Railroad and to help other people escape slavery. Our next cause, Harriet Tubman's song, "Wade in the Water." The effect was that people who were escaping slavery left the trail to get into the water. That way they couldn't be traced by dogs that were sent out to find anyone who had gone missing. We're going to work on continued causes and effects in our social studies textbook. We're going to work on pages 144 to 153. So our first cause that we read at the very beginning was that American settlers found fertile farmland as they moved west. The effect was that settlers came into conflict with Native Americans and plantations also became larger. So that was one of the first things we read here on this page. Let's go on and read the following pages. The Indian Removal Act. As settlers expanded into new areas, they came into conflict with Native Americans. The American government signed treaties with the Native Americans to protect their lands. However, many settlers moved onto these lands anyway. The American government did little to stop the settlers. At the beginning of the 1830s, almost 125,000 Native Americans lived on land in the Southeast. Settlers wanted the Native Americans off these lands. Some states in the Southeast passed laws to try to remove Native Americans from their lands. President Andrew Jackson, who was elected in 1828, promised to remove Native Americans from land that American settlers wanted. In 1830, President Jackson signed a law passed by Congress called the Indian Removal Act. This law gave the federal government the right to take the lands held by Native Americans in the Southeast and give the land to the West in the West in return. The Indian Removal Act said that the government had to treat the Native Americans fairly. So let's go ahead and take a look at the map that we have down here. Now here we can see that this was Native American removal, and we can take a look at our map key. The darker green says Native American lands before relocation. So these were the different areas where Native American tribes were living. The purple was the Cherokee, the yellow was the Creek, the turquoise was the Chickasaw, the orange is the Seminole, and the Choctaw was the red. So all of these people were all moved and relocated into this small area out west. The law also said that the government could not use force to remove Native Americans from their land. They did not have to give up their lands if they did not want to. President Jackson ignored these parts of the law. He used the military to force Native Americans from their lands. Starting in May 1838, the federal soldiers rounded up 16,000 Cherokee living in the Southeast and marched them to present-day Oklahoma. The conditions were harsh and blankets and supplies were limited. At least 4,000 Cherokee died while traveling. Many were buried in unmarked graves along the way. This forced march of the Cherokee people is known as the Trail of Tears. Other Native Americans were removed from their lands and forced to go to Oklahoma. Some tried to resist removal. The Seminole in Florida fought against the American army. Many people died. Eventually, the Seminole were also removed from their lands. So going back to our graphic organizer, our second cause is that the nation expanded westward and settlers wanted to move onto Native American land. The effect was that the US government issued the Indian Removal Act, which forced Native Americans from their lands and pushed them out west. Slavery and opposition. The first enslaved Africans were brought to Virginia in 1619. These enslaved Africans were put to work on the tobacco farms. They were not paid for their work, nor were they free to leave the farms. Tobacco farming took a lot of work. As more farmers grew tobacco, they wanted more enslaved Africans to do the work. Enslaved Africans had no freedom, worked long hours, were bought and sold, and were often punished cruelly. It was a very hard life. As the colonies grew, so did the trading of enslaved Africans. Charleston, South Carolina, and New Orleans, Louisiana became busy ports for the ships carrying enslaved Africans to America. Biography, Nat Turner. Nat Turner was born into slavery in Virginia. Unlike most enslaved people, he learned how to read and write. He also learned about Christianity. As Turner grew older, he preached to other enslaved people. He told them that God had chosen him to free them from slavery. On August 21st, 1831, Turner led 6 other enslaved people in a rebellion. More than 50 plantation owners and their family members were killed. Turner was captured after hiding out for 6 weeks. Turner and other enslaved people were executed for participating in the rebellion. Harsh new laws were passed to prevent future rebellions. So our next cause and effect, we can talk about how slavery was very cruel and unjust to African people. Okay, let's move on to our next reading pages for this lesson. And we're going to read about the spread of slavery. In the 1800s, the nation was divided over the issue of slavery. Many in the North opposed the practice, while many in the South depended on slavery to make a living. As the United States pushed westward, the issue of slavery became more of a problem. Many people in the North did not want slavery to expand into new territories. Most people in the South felt the opposite way. Compromises were made to try and satisfy both sides. Eventually, though, the differences were too great and the country divided into separate parts. The Confederate States of America. In 1860, the election of Abraham Lincoln as president was a turning point in the fight against slavery. Lincoln was not in support of expanding slavery into the Western territories. Because of his views against the spread of slavery, 7 states from the South seceded or left the United States. Soon, 4 more states also seceded. These 11 states were known as the Confederate States of America. They chose Jefferson Davis as their president. These states drafted a constitution. They raised money and gathered men to fight against the North. This became known as the Civil War. The Civil War began in 1861 when Confederate forces attacked Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina. The war raged on for 4 long years. It officially ended when the Union General Ulysses S. Grant accepted Confederate General Robert E. Lee's surrender in the town of Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, on April 9, 1865. At the end of the war, much of the South was in ruins and needed to be rebuilt. Civil War amendments. 3 amendments to the Constitution were passed as a result of the Civil War. The 13th Amendment was ratified or passed in 1865. It abolished slavery within the United States or any public subject or any place subject to their jurisdiction. In 1868, the 14th Amendment granted citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the United States, including formerly enslaved people. It provided all citizens with equal protection under the laws. In 1870, the 15th Amendment outlawed states from keeping people from voting on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Reconstruction. Reconstruction was the rebuilding of the South after the Civil War. Although African Americans made some initial gains, Southern states later passed laws to limit their rights. During the Civil War movement of the 1950s and 1960s, African Americans would fight for their rights that were denied to them. So in our graphic organizer for our 4th cause, we can say that the North and the South could not reach a permanent compromise about the spread of slavery into new lands or new territories. So what happened as a result, the effect was that the Southern states seceded from the Union, and the Civil War began as a fight between the Northern and Southern states over slavery. Civil rights movement. For nearly 100 years after the end of slavery, African Americans in many parts of the United States did not enjoy the same rights as white Americans. In some places, African Americans could not go to the same schools as whites or use the same public facilities as whites. Although African Americans had the right to vote, most could not exercise this right. They faced violence and unfair practices like special taxes or tests created to stop them from voting. In response, African Americans, along with white supporters, organized their efforts to secure the rights of African Americans. The movement became known as the Civil Rights Movement. Rosa Parks. In 1955, the law in Montgomery, Alabama said that African Americans had to give up their seats to white passengers on city buses. Rosa Parks, an African American woman, refused to give up her seat, and she was arrested. A young Black minister named Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. helped organize the boycott of the Montgomery bus system. A boycott is refusing to buy or do something as a protest. For 382 days, African Americans did not ride the buses in Montgomery. The US Supreme Court ruled that segregated seating or seating set apart as separate from others was unconstitutional. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. believed in nonviolent protests. On August 28, 1963, Dr. King led more than 200,000 people in the March on Washington. Dr. King delivered one of the most famous speeches in American history. His I Have a Dream speech was a call for Americans to look past the color of a person's skin and instead see their character. Dr. King was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee on April 4, 1968. The struggle continues. As a result of the Civil Rights Movement, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was signed into law. This act said that race could not be used to deny someone a job. It also gave the federal government the power to make sure public facilities were integrated. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 went even further. The new law banned all voter literacy tests. Despite these laws, discrimination continues. Today, discrimination affects many people, including African Americans, women, and other minority groups. People continue to fight for equality in education, employment, and civil rights. In 2018, the Rally to End Racism was held in Washington, D.C. Speakers encouraged the crowd to take a stand against racism and discrimination. All right, that takes us to the end of the reading for this section, and we can go back and fill in our last cause and effect here. Now, our last cause over here will be that civil rights activists worked to end segregation and discrimination. And the effect was that Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Once you've completed these pages using neat handwriting, please go ahead and hop into the Write About It section. In this section, it says, how did reading about the Indian Removal Act help you to better understand the Native American experience in the 19th century? Consider what the text says about the journey and what it must have been like to leave their homes. Then once you've completed answering that section, you're going to go into the connection to the essential question. From what you read in the lesson, think about how different people responded to conflicts in the Southeast. How did these conflicts affect the way of life of different groups of people in the Southeast? How did the individuals and groups resist unfair treatment? So here you can talk about at the end of the Civil War, how some of the enslaved African Americans were free, but they still faced different kinds of discrimination. You can talk about some of the activists such as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and his peaceful protests. You can talk about Rosa Parks. So there's a lot of information you can put into this section. That's it for this lesson. If you guys have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, I hope you have a great day. Take care. Bye-bye.